Bienvenidos a The Spanish Hacker. In today's video, we're going to hack verbs. So first, let's take a look at why Spanish verbs are so difficult for English speakers who are learning Spanish. So in Spanish, you must conjugate verbs, which means the verbs change from the infinitive form. Also, the traditional approach for learning how to use conjugated verbs is highly ineffective and can even hinder progress. So what is the traditional approach? In the traditional approach to learning verb conjugation, students learn or practice one verb tense at a time, typically starting with the present simple tense. While learning and practicing one verb tense at a time, the student also learns and practices all 6 or 7 personal pronouns for each verb. Some verb tenses or moods, such as the subjunctive mood, are viewed as, quote, advanced and are not introduced to the learner until much later on in the process. And the issue here is that certain very basic communication is passed over, such as, for example, if you want to say, have a nice day, in Spanish, it would be que tengas un buen día, which is using the subjunctive mood. So here's a list of pros and cons to the traditional approach. Let's look at the cons first. So it limits your communicative ability. When you learn only one verb tense at a time, you learn to make phrases and sentences, and it appears as if you are learning and doing really well with the language, yet what you can communicate with that one verb tense is extremely limited. It's unnatural. There's an approach towards learning foreign languages called the natural approach, which involves looking at how children learn their first language. There are some clear advantages and disadvantages to this approach, but what we want to think about is the fact that most native Spanish speakers don't know what a conjugation chart is, nor do they know how to fill one out, and that should tell us something. The last con is that it's typically out of context, like I said, in a conjugation chart. It's unnecessary, and it trains us to stop and think. So if you're trying to speak in Spanish, yet you're stopping and pausing and you're conjugating verbs in your head, this is a major impedance. And now let's look at the pros. This is an example of the conjugation chart that typically goes with the traditional approach. This is for the verb hablar, which means to talk or to speak in English. And you can see in the first and third columns the singular and plural pronouns, and then the conjugated verb in the second and fourth columns. Okay, so now what is the alternative approach? So let's take a look at this chart that compares the traditional versus the alternative approach. Traditional approach, like we've talked about, you learn one verb tense / mood at a time. In the alternative approach, you're going to learn 6 verb tenses / moods at a time. How are we going to do that? Well, in the traditional approach, you're looking at 6 personal pronouns, whereas in the alternative approach, you're just going to focus on the first person singular, yo. Final difference is the traditional approach typically presents these verb conjugations in a chart, and with the alternative approach, we're going to do it in context. So here's an example. Not a big fan of the charts. I just made this chart so that you could see a comparison of the traditional versus the alternative approach. As you can see, I've chosen a present tense, 3 past tenses with the preterite and present perfect, a future tense, and the subjunctive. And the best way to familiarize yourself with these tenses and moods is to see them in examples and context. So for example here, if you want to make a statement, a fact, you will use the present simple tense. Hablo 3 idiomas. I speak 3 languages. If you want to talk about a completed action in the past, use the preterite. Anoche hablé con mis papás. Last night, I spoke with my parents. If you want to talk about a repeated or habitual action in the past, use the imperfect. Cuando era niño, no hablaba mucho. When I was a kid, I didn't speak a lot. To talk about an action that started in the past but has a present aspect to it, use the present perfect. He hablado con muchas personas hoy. I have spoken with many people today. To talk about the future, use the future tense. Hablaré contigo mañana. I will speak with you tomorrow. And to express desires, wishes, needs, doubts, and suggestions, use the subjunctive. Mi profesora de español quiere que yo hable más fuerte. My Spanish professor wants me to speak louder. Let's take a look at now what you could talk about. Habits, routines, universal truths, hypothetical situations. Past events, completed, repeated, started but not completed. Future events, and desires, wishes, doubts, recommendations, emotions, and possibilities with the subjunctive. So all of that now we can communicate, whereas before we could only talk about basically this first bullet point. Okay, let's do a practice with the alternative approach. So we're going to work with the verb caminar, which is to walk. We have the word bank here with your 6 different choices. Down here, I have a sentence with a blank, and you'll choose one of the words from the word bank that goes in the appropriate space. El próximo año, blank, un maratón. And the answer is caminaré. So the clue here is el próximo año, next year. So we're talking about the future, and we will use the future tense, caminaré. Okay, next one is blank, muchos maratones en mi vida. The answer is he caminado muchos maratones en mi vida. Next one, los fines de semana, blank, en el parque. Camino. So you're just making a statement about what your routine is. So on the weekends, I walk in the park. Present tense, camino. Cuando era niño, blank, a la escuela. Cuando era niño, caminaba a la escuela. When I was a kid, I used to walk to school. So it's a repeated action in the past. So we use the imperfect tense, caminaba. Okay, the final one. So our choices that we have left are caminé and camine. Number 1, el fin de semana pasado, no, blank, porque estaba enfermo. And number 2, el médico quiere que blank por 30 minutos al día. So the clue, el fin de semana pasado, last weekend, or in the past, preterite tense. No caminé porque estaba enfermo. And number 2, el médico quiere que camine por 30 minutos al día. Camine, because whenever we see this phrase querer que, quiere que, so it's a want or desire, that always 100% triggers a subjunctive. And that's it for today's video. If this approach makes sense to you and you'd like to get more practice with it, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel, because I'll be posting comprehensible input videos that use this approach and methodology. Hasta la próxima.